Okay, today we are going to talk or to answer questions about the use of instruments in quantitative research studies. They are, uh, uh, until some days ago, it was the only type of research studies, but now we have qualitative and also have uh, mixed method research studies. But today we are going to talk about quantitative instruments. I will begin with some basic ideas about quantitative research instruments. We need to know what they are, what is its role in quantitative research study, what types of quantitative instruments exist, and some principles, some basic procedures to follow to build instruments and items for this kind of research study. So let's begin with the definition of what a quantitative research instrument is. It can be defined as a tool or a device designed to measure the target variables of a research study. And the important thing in that definition is the word measure, because that is the main assumption of quantitative research study, that the reality exists by itself and that you can quantify it, you can measure it. So you can measure any phenomenon that is part of that reality. And when we say measure, we really say that we can assign numerals to the variables, indicators, according to a specific rules. And then when we say variables, indicators, those indicators are the traits, the facts, the characteristics that make the existence of the variable evident. So they are the little things that when you look at them, you say, hey, I'm talking of this variable, or am in the presence of this variable. And it says according to specific rules, because when you assign numerals, when you measure the indicators of a variable, you have to follow some rules. For instance, you can say, okay, if I have two different genders, so one gender will be 1 and the other one will be 2. That is a rule. Or when you say, for instance, okay, the achievement of this student can be considered that it is 10 points out of 15. That's a rule because you are specifying how numerals will be assigned. Do you have any question with this definition, Audrey? Something that you want to ask? Okay, great. Let's continue. Now, it's time to talk about the role of instruments in quantitative research study. What do we use them for? And instruments, when you are developing a quantitative research study, instruments are intended to collect valid and reliable data. And what are you expected to do with that data? Well, you have to answer the research questions or test the hypothesis. So the role of an instrument in research is to let you gather data that can be valid and reliable enough to answer the research question or testing the hypothesis. And when we say valid data, we are referring to that gathered information that truly represent the studied phenomenon. I mean, the data that you are collecting is in fact what is needed in order to understand the phenomenon that you are studying. When your data really represents the phenomenon, the variables of the phenomenon, you are in the presence of valid data. And when we say that the data that you gather through the instrument should be reliable, we're really saying that the gathered information is consistent, is stable. It can be, whenever you apply the instrument, you get very similar results. And that's why you say that the data is reliable. And the cause for having that reliable data through the instrument is that there is minimal measurement error. Okay? All right. Now, if we can use an instrument to get valid data and reliable data, we can say that the instrument is valid and the instrument is reliable. So the characteristic, the words valid and reliable are not only applied to the data, but also to the instrument. So when we say that an instrument is valid, we are really saying that it measures what it's intended to measure. In other words, if you want to measure, for instance, an ability to do something, then that instrument should be able to measure just that. And when we say that it's reliable, is because whenever you applied it, it produces stable and consistent results. And then this is a very interesting claim. An instrument can be reliable without being valid. And let me explain why. To be valid, an instrument, you say, has to be reliable first. In other words, the instrument must be able to produce stable and consistent results. However, an instrument can be reliable because it produces that kind of results whenever it is applied, without being valid because it measures something different from what is expected to measure. Let me give you an example. Suppose that you want to apply, you have created an instrument, a multiple choice test, to measure the selling skills of salespeople. And you apply that instrument, get some data, and when you analyze it, you find whenever you apply that instrument, you get stable and consistent results. But when you really look at the very carefully to the instrument, you may find that in fact that instrument is measuring people's knowledge of the product they are selling rather than their ability to counsel and convince clients. And perhaps the point is that the instrument is a multiple choice test and the items are focused on the product rather than on the ability of the people to sell, to convince other people to buy their products. And whenever you apply that instrument, you get a stable and consistent result. So it is reliable, but it is not valid because it is measuring something quite different of what it is intended to measure. Any question, Audrey, about this valid and reliable issue? Okay, so let's continue and let's talk about types of quantitative instrument. Of course, this is not a complete classification or a complete list of quantitative instruments, but they are four of the more used. The first three are very used in social science. The checklist is also used in social science, but many times it is also used in scientific studies. When I say nature, biology, and that kind of things. So we can say that we have questionnaire, scale, test, and checklist. And there is something that I want to make clear before continuing, is that questionnaire has been used in an interchangeable way with survey. So people used to say that, oh, I'm going to use a service, I'm going to use a questionnaire. Since it is widely used in that way, okay, everybody seems to understand what it really means. However, there is some deeper differences between questionnaire and survey, and is that a survey is in fact the measurement of a variable by means of asking questions. So it refers to the technique, in fact, not to the instrument. And the actual tool, the actual instrument to conduct a survey is a questionnaire. Okay, so one is a tool, one is an instrument, and the other one is a technique to do that. So, okay, so let's look at each one of those things very carefully, and in order to have a better idea of them. Sorry, I need some water, and I got it. Okay. Oh yeah, Audrey, that one is one of the difference that very few people try to make it clear. So everybody says, oh, no, I'm going to apply a survey, I'm going to apply a questionnaire. And the fact is that the survey is the technique, and the questionnaire is the tool used to that. Okay, so let's talk about questionnaire. Say, well, what it is? Well, it is a tool, it's a device, which is usually printed, and you use it to gather data for a survey, okay? And by means of questions and other prompts. So a questionnaire, as the term implies, is made of questions. And they are usually in a printed way, even though you can also make a questionnaire and apply it orally. Okay? And you say, well, when should I use it? When you want to gather data, self-reported, about knowledge, attitudes, skills, behavior, etc. And we say self-reported because the questionnaire is answered by a person, and the questions that are there refer to them. In such a way, they report what they know, or what their attitudes are, or their skills are, or the behaviors are. So it's a self-report that is conducted through questions. It has advantages. For instance, it is easy to analyze, it's easy to report, and it can be applied to large samples of population, because after you create or you build the questionnaire, it's not difficult to apply it. You can either do it online, or you can send it by email, or you can send it by mail. Okay, and this one is an advantage that many people really appreciate, especially when the theme is sensible in a certain way, and it is that it is possible to have anonymity. Okay? And it could be relatively bias free, because if you are able to build items that are not biased, the whole questionnaire will be bias free, because the researcher will not have to intervene, does not have to influence the answer of the subjects. That's why it is self-reported. And it is easy to adapt to different contexts. It's not so difficult to create a questionnaire, and if you have to use it in another context, you can make the corresponding changes. For instance, if you can build it to be used with children, and then use it with teenagers, or use it with adults, making some changes. Some disadvantages, well, language or vocabulary may be an issue. In other words, you have to write down the items in such a way that you can be sure that though the items will be interpreted in the way that you expect to them to be answered, or to be understood. And therefore, you have to use language or vocabulary that are appropriate for the characteristics of the population. It seems a straightforward thing to do, but it's no such. You have to know the characteristics of the population very well, and then write down using the language appropriate for that. This is another disadvantage, that is that people tend to guess what the right answer is, especially if the questionnaire is subjective, is multiple choice and that kind of things. So people say, what am I expected to answer, and try to guess that. And in other occasions, they hurry through the answers. Okay, this one, or this one, and this one. That's something that can be controlled, making clear the durations before applying or before administering the questionnaire. They are time and experience consuming to decide. Yeah, they are easy to analyze, easy to apply, easy to report, but you have to spend a lot of time, and you need a lot of experience to create very good questionnaires, especially valid and reliable questionnaires. And sometimes some people perceive questionnaire as impersonal. But that's part of quantitative research. and that's why it is mixed method research uh, is a good option in order to address that kind of disadvantage. Any question, Audrey, about questionnaire? Okay. So let's go to scale. Usually when we say scale, we think of, for instance, the temperature scale or the scale that we use at the kitchen. But in this case, they are instruments too. But in research, when we talk about a scale, we talk about a tool for measuring the intensity of a behavioral variable. It is well used in social science research and education research also, because uh, it let us um, gather information about behavior, attitude, opinions, and that kind of things in a quantitative way. Of course, that kind of variables are usually more um, appropriate to study using qualitative methods. But it's possible to use quantitative methods in using them. And scales can be nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. And this is according to their power of measure. In that sense, nominal has the slight power. It has less power of to measure than, for instance, a ratio. And when we say, for instance, let's talk a little about each one of them so you can have a good idea what we are talking about. So a nominal scale, as we see, is the lowest measured level you can use, of course, from a statistical point of view. And it is, as the name implies, is simply placing data into categories without any order, without any structure. Let's see, a physical example of a nominal scale is that we use color, for instance. You know, the spectrum, the underlying spectrum of colors is ordered, but the names that we apply to each one of them are not. What is blue is blue. The word blue was assigned in a random way at the beginning when it was beginning to use. So in research, the classical example of a nominal scale is yes, no. A scale when somebody presents to you an item, which you have to say yes or no. There is no order. There is no distance between yes and no. Okay, so it is a nominal scale. And when you are going to analyze items that of a nominal scale, you assign numbers to each one of those elements, and then use statistics that are called non-parametric statistics. For instance, you can calculate the mode of the data, or you can use chi-square to make a cross tabulation, for instance. Then we go to a scale that is a little more powerful, which is an ordinal scale. And it is in fact a ranking. Okay? It creates a ranking and say this is better or is stronger than this one, or this is weaker than this one. For instance, when a market researcher is trying to know how people rank, let's say, 5 different types of beer, for instance, and says, please tell me which one is the most flavorful, and which one is the least flavorful. So it is asking for a scale of preference, an ordinal scale of preference. But there is no an objective distance, for instance, between 2 points of that scale. Suppose for me, one beer is the top one, and there is another one which is the second one. And perhaps for you, you have the same opinion, but the distance between my most flavorful beer and the second one could be shorter than yours or larger than yours. So we can perceive different distance between the most flavorful beer and the second one. Okay, so an ordinal scale only lets you interpret order in a gross way and provides certain relative positional distances. They are well used because we know one which is very, very used, which is Likert scale, is in fact an ordinal one, even though it is analyzed and treated as an interval one. And there are many controversies about that, because from the statistical and mathematical point of view, it is an ordinal scale, but researchers treat it as an interval one and do perform statistical analysis that correspond to an interval one. Okay? But if you remember how a Likert scale is, it says, for instance, I disagree, I absolutely disagree, I disagree, no opinion, I agree, absolutely agree. Okay, yeah, you have a ranking, but what is the distance between absolutely disagree and disagree? I can perceive the distance in a different way as you can do it. Okay? Well, when you have ordinal scales, you use non-parametric statistics, and it means that you can, for instance, calculate the median, the mode, the rank order correlation, and you can perform a non-parametric analysis of variance. Okay? And the next one is interval. These scales is the standard survey rating scale. And let's say, for instance, when you create an instrument to check job satisfaction, and you create a 7-point scale from dissatisfied to satisfied, and each one of those correspond to exactly a number. However, there is not a true zero, so it's not completed. It's not a completed scale in the sense that there is no a zero. And when we compare it to an ordinal scale, we can see that in an ordinal scale, we talk about differences in order, and in interval scale, we are talking about differences in the degree of order. Okay? And when you have this kind of interval scale, you use parametric statistical techniques, and that is what I told you before, that Likert scale are treated as interval scales, and we perform analysis like mean and standard deviation, correlation, regression, analysis of variance, and factor analysis. This is the interval scales are the most used in research. And also you can use non-parametric statistic with this type of scales, but they are not, those analyses are not so powerful as the parametric ones. Okay? And finally, this ratio scale is the top level of measurement because it really has a true zero. And it is not very used in social research because it's not common that you have a variable that has zero characteristic. Okay, or let's say 0 degree of a characteristic in order to have a true zero. So that's why we use interval scales rather than ratio one. And even in physical science research, it's not so common to have the zero, the true zero. Even when we're talking about temperature, they say, okay, I have a zero in a temperature scale. Yes, but there is a lot of discussion if that means that is absence of temperature. Okay, so any question about scales, Audrey? Okay, you say, do you feel using a scale in general is a reliable data collection tool? I have observed individual checking anything in order to complete it quickly unless they are passionate, mostly angry about it. Yeah, that depends on how you build the scale. I mean, if you are able to build a really valid scale and you include good directions and you create the atmosphere in order to make the subjects aware of the importance of the research, you can do that. Yeah, absolutely. They are very, very useful when you are, for instance, researching attitudes, opinions. And if you can combine it with a quality tool also, then you make a triangulation of the results, and I'm sure that you can get, or you can gather valid and reliable data. I mean, you know, there are some people that create scales that are so easy to cheat on that it is a kind of game to cheat with that. And I confess that I used to do that when I studied, because I have the scales, and then I say, hey, this answer is not possible, and this one is not possible. I mean, or sometimes you can say, okay, if this person is studying attitudes of a student, and I'm not going to answer none of the extreme because I'm not supposed to disagree, absolutely. And that's one of the disadvantages of a scale, when people tend to avoid extreme answers and get what they think they expected to respond. But if you can complete the instrument with another one, and you can you are able to give good orations and create a proper atmosphere, you won't have any problem. And I say when to use scales, when you want to measure attitudes, opinions, and other behavioral variables. They have some advantages. They are easy to use and scores. They are inexpensive, and they provide 4 quantitative ways to gather and analyze data, because you have 4 different types of scales that you can choose from in order to get the data that you really want to. Apart from the disadvantage that we have already said, answers to previous items influence the following responses. So you can say, okay, I answered this on that above. Now I have to answer something that is coherent with that in this time. But as I said before, if you can complement with that, for instance, an interview, you will be able to see how valid the answers were. Okay, let's continue with test. For some people, test is a questionnaire, and in fact, it is. However, tests are so used, especially in education, that we can consider it a different type of instrument, especially because they have a difference with a questionnaire. That is, in this case, a tool, measure a variable of knowledge or the skill. Okay, a questionnaire can do that too. Well, the thing is that when you use a test, that variable, the degree of that variable is contrasted to a previously established set of criteria of a standard. So a test responds to a set of criteria or standards that the performance on the test is compared to. And the test can be fill in the blank, true, false, multiple choice, or it's called objective too, short answers, and even essays. And when you have to use a test, well, when you want to assess knowledge or a skill level, especially when an intervention has been applied. And that's why it is very used in education, because you are making a research, and that research has an intervention. And then you want to see how powerful that intervention was for what you are looking for. And that is a test. Of course, as I said before, is a questionnaire, but a very special kind of questionnaire, because it is always compared or contrasted with a set of criteria or a standard. The advantages of a test is that they can be used to measure achievement and accountability. They are very good for that. They are easy to score and analyze, and you can compare between performances in an easy way. And that's what it says when what we do when you apply a test to a sample of a population, and then you compare who did it best and who did it worst against the criteria that is that we are working with. Disadvantages, well, validity may be an issue. You know, nearly any teacher creates a test and thinks that the test that she or he is creating is a good one. And perhaps most of the time they are, but they are not tested for validity. And then it is possible that the test is measuring something different that it is intended to measure. Of course, there are standardized tests, and they are supposed to be the greatest tool. However, standardized tests also have problems because they are created for a wide population, and it leaves out, or they leaves out, um, some special characteristics of the sample of that you are working with, of your students. Okay, so they can be too impersonal and too different from the characteristic of the population of the student that you are researching. And of course, language or vocabulary may affect item comprehension, so the researcher has to be very careful on the way that using the appropriate language or the appropriate vocabulary. Do you have any question about tests? Okay, you must be a teacher already. That are so used to tests. Okay, then we have the checklist. You know, a checklist is used in research mostly to say, okay, I have done this, and I have done this, and this other thing, and it's okay, I have done everything. But this is not the checklist that we are going to talk about, because we are going to talk about how to use a checklist to make an observation. So this checklist is a tool for gathering quantitative data during observation by determining the presence, the absence, frequency, or intensity of a behavior. Sometimes in your research, you have to do an observation. And the first type of instrument that you think of an information is a narrative, which is a quality instrument. Okay, that's a good way of doing it. But sometimes things move so quickly, and you want to use quantitative. You want to gather quantitative data in order to have at least a good picture of what is happening in a very quick way. Well, a checklist can do that. And then you say, for instance, let's suppose that you are making a research with a teacher, how a teacher uses a specific strategy, teaching strategy. And then you say, okay, let's check if this person follow the procedure to introduce the work when they come to the classroom. And they say, okay, he say hello, yeah, or oh, he forgot to tell the student this, and so on. Oh yes, and if this person, for instance, repeat the duration for the task twice, and another teacher repeated 3 times, and so on. So that's the way of that's the kind of checklist that I'm talking about. And you use it well when you want to register and quantify observed behaviors. The advantages, well, they are labor and time efficient. You can create them easily, and is easy to score, and is quick to score. And they provide a framework to perform the observation. So you create a checklist using some criteria of what the expected behavior should be, and then you check the presence of the absence of the frequency of that behavior. Disadvantages, well, may be biased by the recorder, but any observation at the end could be biased by the recorder, even if it's a narrative. Only the behaviors considered in the criteria can be raised. And that's true. You have a criteria, and you check the presence or absence of that criteria, and perhaps you do not register all things. However, you can include some items in the checklist to do that. Any question out there? Yeah, you can use a checklist for your quality, um, let's say, observation checklist. However, always include open um, items in which you can register things that hold your attention and that are not in the um, checklist, in the closed items of the checklist. Okay, well, talking about that, talking about how you can build your checklist for that observation, guided observation, and let's talk about some principles that you can follow when you are creating quantitative instruments. The first thing that we need to do is to identify the variables of the study in order to know what needs to be measured. So you have to know, okay, these are my variables, and I have to measure this and this, and therefore, in that way, you know what you should look for. And it is also important to establish the indicators of each variable. In other words, what are the things, what are the behaviors, what are the elements that will show that the variable is being performed? For instance, let's suppose my, my, my favorite one, reading comprehension, is one of my variables. Okay, what will be the indicators of that student is really comprehending what she is reading? So I have to write down the indicator, to identify the indicators of each variable. And that's important because that will be used when you are going to write down items. Okay, you know what the variables are, you know what the indicators of which for each variable are. So it's time to select the type of instrument and items you will need to gather valid and reliable data. If I have this indicator for this variable, which is the best instrument to do this, to gather data of this type? Should I use a questionnaire, or should I use a scale, or should I use a checklist, or should I use other things? Remember, we are talking about quantitative instruments, okay? So that's why we do not include interviews and so on, even though those methods or those instruments, sorry, can be also used in a quantitative way. But today we try to focus basically on true quantitative instruments. And once you know the instrument that you want to do, for instance, let's suppose a questionnaire, you need to know what type of items you are going to include in that questionnaire. Are you going to use only closed questions, or are you going to use only open-ended questions, or are you going to use both of them? And the criterion to choose refers to which one is more appropriate to get the kind of data that I need to answer the questions or to test the hypothesis. Well, the next step is easy. It says, well, let's review literature in order to know if there is an instrument that can be used in this study. And it responds to a principle of economy, because if there is one instrument already developed, already applied, already that has already been considered valid and reliable, and that instrument can be really, or can address the variables that I'm working with and the population and the context in which I'm working, why should I create a new one? I mean, it is a win-win situation. It's a win situation for the researcher, because that person does not have to, can save effort and time and resources. And it's a win situation for the developer of that instrument, because that your data will help that person prove again the validity and reliability of the instrument. If no instrument is available, then you have to know how similar instruments have been designed in order to have a good set of durations. Okay? All right, then you set up criteria to measure each indicator of each target variables. So you need, when you build an instrument, your instrument should be in accordance to the set of criteria. And that set of criteria needs to be in accordance to the indicators of the variable. In other words, how are you going to measure each indicator? What is the criteria that you are going to use in order to measure an indicator of, for instance, of reading comprehension? Once you have defined the criteria that you are going to follow for each indicator, for each variable, it's time to create the items for that indicator. Okay? And it's easy when you have a clear set of criteria, because you are going to say, okay, let's see, knowledge of vocabulary in reading comprehension should needs, which is an indicator of reading comprehension, needs to be measured by this. What the student has to do in order to know, to demonstrate that he or she has a vocabulary, for understanding text. That is a criterion, and that's part of the set of criteria. Okay? Any questions so far, Audrey? Okay. So, talking about items, item must be clear. You have to be very careful with the language, with the vocabulary that you use with an item, and you have to be sure that that item, that vocabulary and that language can be understood easily by the subjects of your research. Remember that we have seen that some disadvantages of some quantitative instruments are related to language and vocabulary. Items should be also short. If you create a long item, that increases the the options, or not the option, the possibilities of being misunderstood, because there are many words, and that implies that you will need to read more and that you have to be a better reader. Okay? So items must be clear and short. For the same reason, try to avoid jargon, different words, specific terms, that kind of words that are not widely known. Okay, so all those things: be clear, be short, be use an appropriate language for the population. This the next one is very frequent, and I consider it a very frequent source of mistakes and of data that is not valid. You need to avoid including two different ideas in the same item. Sometimes you write down an item that says, do you do this? Or do you or do you will do this in another moment? Or you say, okay, what is your opinion about quantitative, and what are you going to do with this? So there are two different ideas, and how do you know if the person has the same opinion for both ideas? Or if the answer of the person refers just to one of those ideas and not to the other one. That creates confusion for you. That creates confusion in the subject, and also that creates answers that you are not be able to know to what part of that item the answer refers to. So the most simple thing is one item, one idea. It's the same with a paragraph. One paragraph, one focus. One item, one focus. It is better to have two items instead of one confusing one. Then avoid biased or leading items. Don't write down the item in a way that the person is being led to one answer that reflects your bias. Isn't it true that this is the best thing that can be done? No, that's bias. Okay? And all those things are then evident or can be detected if you pilot the instrument. If you do a previous administration of the instrument as if it were the research study itself, and you gather data and analyze that data and test the validity of the instrument in terms of construct and content. Validity of construct, which is when it measures what it's supposed to measure, the concepts that it is supposed to measure, and the content and the content validity, which is the estimate of how much a measure represents every single element of the construct that you are working with, or the concept that you are working with. And you can also check reliability of the instrument when you do a pilot study. And there are different ways of calculating that reliability. That depends on the kind of instrument that you're working with. For instance, you can use a test retest. In other words, you you apply the instrument to the sample, and then you applied it once again and check the results and calculate the reliability of that instrument. Or you can use parallel forms, which is that you have two tests which are parallel in the sense that they have the same structure, they have similar items, even though they are not exactly the same, but they can be considered parallel. And then you apply both forms and check how reliable the findings of those forms are. Or you can use, for instance, inter-rater reliability, in which different persons analyze and the results or the answers of the subjects, and then you compare the analysis of each one of them and see if the instrument behave the same for both raters. Or you can also check the internal consistent reliability, something that is very used with scales, in which you can, for instance, divide the instrument and you make the correlation. For instance, you can use a split. You split the test in two parts and check how each part behaves and calculate the consistency of the results of that. Or you can calculate the internal consistencies, reliability, when you calculate how each items behave in relation to the rest of the items of the instrument. So you also will be able to check the understanding of the language, and you will be quite sure that the language is the appropriate one before applying it to your own sample. And you can see how you can administer it, how you can apply it, and see if there is any problem with one part, you need more time, and so on. So a pilot study is a great tool to check how well an instrument has been created. Once you have that data of the pilot study, you use it to improve the instrument. Any question? Okay. Do you plan to present a use of instrument in qualitative research study webinar? Well, qualitative research studies is Dr. James' expertise area, right? So I'm not going to talk about qualitative research studies, but I think that she can do it, no problem. I always take the quantitative and mixed methods part, and she takes the qualitative one. Okay. Any other question? Any other things that you want to talk about?